Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for a public audience. In the early hours before dawn, when the world is most silent, there are certain stories, dangerous stories, that begin whispering again. Stories that should have died with the men who lived them, yet somehow refused to stay buried. And tonight, you're going to hear one of them. It begins with a boy, 6 years old. Small hands, soft voice, no history, no reason to be feared. And yet, when he opened his mouth, hardened men felt something they hadn't felt since war. A chill, a recognition, a memory that should have been impossible. Because the boy didn't say who he was. He said who he used to be. I am Jesse James. He said it the way a man confesses a crime, slow, deliberate, without blinking. And what followed was not the rambling fantasy of a child. It was knowledge buried in graves, locked in bank vaults, and whispered only by men who'd sworn never to speak again. Not just names, routes, safe houses, exact phrases Jesse spoke only to men who rode with him under blood-red sunsets. But here's what people miss. The real horror didn't begin with the claim. It began with the proof. The kind of proof a 6-year-old boy should never have. Unless something older, something feral, something unfinished had slipped back into him. And if you think this is just another reincarnation story, you're not listening closely enough. Because Jesse James wasn't just an outlaw. He was a symbol of fracture line in American history where corruption, state power, and hidden agendas collided like tectonic plates. Jesse's life, and especially his death, still vibrates through this country like a tuning fork struck by unseen hands. Someone wanted him dead. Someone wanted him erased. Someone wanted the legend cut clean at the root. But legends don't die when the body dies. Sometimes they slip sideways, into the nearest open vessel, into the next life, into the next boy born under the right sky, in the right soil, under the wrong damn century. And when that boy speaks, men listen, because deep down, every man knows he carries shadows older than himself. History he didn't live but somehow remembers. Crimes he never committed yet feels guilty for. Strength he never earned yet senses burning beneath his ribs. Tonight, you're not just hearing a story. You're stepping into a fracture, tear in the veil, a place where identity bends and time bleeds. The first sign that something ancient had slipped into the boy didn't come from his words. Came from his eyes. People underestimate the power of a gaze. But men who've lived hard lives, soldiers, sheriffs, men who've buried friends in unmarked graves, they know. They can look into a child's eyes and tell instantly whether they're staring at innocence or experience. And when they looked into his eyes, they didn't see a boy. They saw a memory staring back. A memory with unfinished business. At first, his parents tried to explain it away. Children imagine things. They mimic what they hear. But the boy was speaking of things no one had mentioned in decades. Details that only a handful of survivors could possibly know. Men who drunk with Jesse, stolen with Jesse, and watched him do things that the history books still refuse to print. And the boy described them not like a storyteller, but like a man remembering his own hands, his own gun, his own life. But here's what you weren't told. The boy didn't claim Jesse's name to feel special. He claimed it because something in him hurt. Late at night he would cry and whisper, "They killed me before I was finished." He said it the way a dying man speaks through someone else's mouth. His mother heard him pacing the floorboards in the dark, counting steps like a prisoner pacing a cell. His father watched him study maps with the intensity of a general preparing for his final campaign. Neighbors saw him ride a horse with instincts that don't come from practice but from memory carved into muscle long before he was born. And the more he remembered, the more something awakened in him. Something heavier, older, built from violence and betrayal. Because Jesse James didn't die peacefully. He died in treachery, shot in the back by a man he trusted. A death like that leaves residue. Not spiritual, not paranormal. Something deeper, psychological, ancestral, magnetic. A kind of encoded trauma that hunts for a vessel strong enough to carry it forward. And what's worse, the moment the boy began remembering Jesse's final breath, the world around him shifted. Animals reacted differently to him. Men stood straighter in his presence. And the land itself, those Missouri woods, felt like they recognized him before his parents did. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't reincarnation. This was a return. A return triggered by forces older than law, older than country, older than the institutions that think they hold control over identity, history, and destiny. Before we go deeper, comment, "The past lives through me," twice, not for engagement, but to mark the point where your old self ends. And the descent begins. There is a moment so subtle most men never notice it, when a story stops being entertainment and starts becoming a mirror. And that is exactly what happened in Clay County when the boy who carried Jesse's shadow began revealing details no child should know. The change didn't begin with a confession. It began with recognition. Old men who had ridden with bushwhackers, men who still flinched at the crack of a branch breaking behind them, found themselves staring at this boy the way soldiers stare at ghosts on the battlefield. Not because he looked like Jesse, not because he sounded like him, but because the boy knew them. He called them by names they hadn't heard in 30 years. Nicknames Jesse created in the mud and gun smoke of the Civil War borderlands. Names spoken only around campfires, in the quiet hours before raids, in the last seconds before men died. He would look at them and say things like, "You still limp when it rains, Sam," or "You never told your wife where the money's hidden, Bill." And the men hardened. Bitter men would turn pale. Those weren't things written in newspapers. Those weren't stories passed down in family gossip. Those were private truths buried in the minds of men who had ridden through blood. But the boy didn't stop there. He began reenacting things he should never have been able to mimic. Not even if he'd memorized a dozen outlaw biographies. He could tie knots used only by Quantrill's guerrillas. He spoke in slang that hadn't been heard since Reconstruction. He gave orders with a tone that made grown men obey without thinking. And here's the part the history books skip. He led, not with charm, not with innocence, but with the confidence of a man who had cheated death once and refused to do it again. The drifters, the veterans, the men nursing old grudges, they didn't follow the boy. They followed the echo inside him. Because even after death, Jesse James was a gravitational force. A symbol of rebellion. A man who refused to kneel to the powers that tried to script his life and erase his name. And the institutions that buried the truth about Jesse. They felt the shift too. Because the boy wasn't just remembering. He was resurrecting something they thought they'd stamped out. A lineage of defiance. A blueprint of psychological warfare against the systems that shape men and break them. In every era, there's always one man who wakes up early. One man who remembers what others forget. And now, the boy had remembered too much. By the winter of his 13th year, the boy no longer behaved like someone remembering a past life. He behaved like someone returning to unfinished work. And this is where the story turns from strange to dangerous. Because the moment a man, no matter his age, begins to act with purpose older than his body, institutions start to watch him. Quietly, from a distance. With the same suspicion they hold toward anyone who refuses to fit into the identity they were assigned. The first institution to notice was the local sheriff's office. Reports started piling in. A boy seen riding alone at night, moving through the forest like he'd memorized it over a lifetime. A boy drawing maps of the countryside with the precision of a surveyor. A boy seen speaking with men twice, even 3 times his age, men with records, grudges, and blood on their resumes. But here's what unsettled the sheriff most. Those men didn't treat the boy like a kid. They didn't laugh at him, mock him, or dismiss him. They listened, and when he spoke, they obeyed. The sheriff once told a confidant, never publicly, never in writing. It was like watching Jesse command a gang again. Not similar, not reminiscent, the same. But this isn't where the darkness truly sharpens. That comes next. Because the boy began revealing not just memories, but secrets. Secrets about hidden caches Jesse left behind. Secret routes escaped lawmen never documented. Hidden tunnels carved beneath old farmhouses now owned by respectable families. Even buried gold locations the original James gang swore to take to their graves. And when the boy walked directly to those places without hesitation, without guessing, the world seemed to tilt off its axis. But understand this, When a man uncovers hidden treasure, he gets rich. When a boy uncovers treasure tied to outlaw history, he becomes a threat, especially to the forces still invested in the official story of Jesse James. The official story cleans up too neatly: an outlaw murdered by a friend, buried, case closed. But history that tidy is almost always curated, designed, rounded off by those who benefit from the silence. And the boy was breaking that silence. His discoveries didn't just challenge the narrative. They exposed it. Because if Jesse James didn't die as cleanly as the history books claim, if his secrets still mattered, if his legend still had teeth, then someone somewhere was going to do whatever it took to shut this boy up. The first attempt to silence the boy came quietly, not with gunfire, not with confrontation, but with containment. This is how institutions always move against a rising anomaly: slow at first, like a tightening rope around a man's throat. The sheriff's deputies began visiting the Garrett farm under the guise of routine welfare checks. Ministers arrived to advise the family on troubling behaviors. And strangers, well-dressed, soft-spoken men from Kansas City, started appearing with questions no child should ever be asked. But the boy didn't fear them. He recognized them. He would narrow his eyes, tilt his head, and speak to them the same way Jesse spoke to Pinkertons during the war: calm, poised, coiled like a rattlesnake waiting to strike. And the men would leave shaken, whispering things like, "He knows. How could he know? This is not normal." What terrified them wasn't that a boy claimed to be Jesse James. It was that he acted like a man who remembered being hunted by the same kind of men now circling him again. And that's when the boy changed tactics. He stopped merely remembering and began organizing. The three drifters, Hayes, Porter, Wheeler, became the nucleus of something bigger, something structured, something disciplined, something dangerously familiar to the men who still feared the ghost of Missouri's most infamous outlaw. The boy took them into the woods and drilled them like soldiers. He demonstrated ambush techniques Jesse used on Union patrols, techniques never printed in any public account. He taught them how to vanish into terrain so completely that a man could ride past them within 3 feet and never notice. But the darkest part came next. He began speaking about the unfinished score. Not revenge. Not money. A score. A man with a score isn't trying to get rich. He's trying to correct history. And that terrified the institutions watching him, because scores are almost always tied to truths powerful people want buried. The boy claimed Jesse wasn't killed the way the newspapers reported. He claimed the betrayal was orchestrated by forces above Robert Ford. He described a web of influence: politicians, bankers, railroad men who wanted Jesse removed because he knew too much about corruption woven into the nation's early financial arteries. He said he remembered conversations in dark rooms. Men holding cigars like scepters. Maps spread out like battlefields. Decisions made that shaped the next 100 years of American power. And the boy's voice would drop into something cold, ancient, and steady. "I wasn't supposed to die. I was supposed to expose them." That's when the real danger began. Because a child claiming the truth is inconvenient. A child proving it is lethal. What happened next is the part almost no one talks about. Because it's the moment the story stopped being folklore and became a threat. The boy's awakening wasn't just stirring old ghosts. It was destabilizing power. See, powerful institutions can tolerate myths. They can tolerate legends. They can even tolerate a few inconvenient truths buried in dusty archives. But what they cannot tolerate is a living anomaly. A boy who speaks like a man they tried to erase. A boy who remembers corruption they engineered. A boy who resurrects the one outlaw who refused to kneel. That kind of boy isn't a curiosity. He's a liability. And liabilities are handled. The first real warning arrived on a night the Garrett family never forgot. A lantern glow outside the barn. The sound of horses too many to be neighbors. The murmured voices of men trying too hard to sound casual. Robert Garrett stepped outside with a shotgun and saw 3 official-looking riders wearing badges that didn't match any county authority. Behind them lurked 2 men without badges, without uniforms, without names. They asked if Thomas was home. They asked to speak with him privately. They claimed it was for his safety. But every man present could feel the tension in the air. The same tension that men feel before a raid, before a lynching, before an abduction masked as intervention. The boy stepped forward anyway, and this is what froze those men. He didn't cower. He didn't hide. He didn't even ask why they were there. He simply said, "You failed once before. You won't get another chance." The words hit them like a slap, because those weren't the words of a frightened child. They were the words of a man remembering the night armed agents came for him decades earlier, a night that ended with a bullet in his back. One of the riders whispered, "Hell, it's him. It's really him." They left without another word. But that night the boy didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, staring at nothing. When his mother finally asked what worried him, he spoke with the calm confidence of a man who'd already lived through this war once. "They won't come for me again. Next time, they'll come for you." That's when the truth settled in. This wasn't reincarnation. This wasn't imagination. This was a continuation, interrupted once by betrayal, and now again by systems that fear what one awakened memory can unravel. The boy was becoming something institutions could not predict, contain, or control. A catalyst. And catalysts, once activated, don't stop. By the spring of his 15th year, the boy had crossed a threshold that no one, not his parents, not the men watching from the shadows, not even the ones who followed him, fully understood. He no longer behaved like someone influenced by Jesse James. He behaved like someone finishing Jesse's mission. And that's when the real fractures in the official story began to split open. It started with a single map, a hand-drawn outline of Missouri, sketched not like a student learning geography, but like a strategist preparing a campaign. On it were markings representing old Confederate safe houses, abandoned telegraph stations, hidden caches, secret meeting sites used by networks of men who moved money and messages behind the government's back. Some symbols hadn't been used since the final years of the Civil War. No one had taught him these symbols. No one alive even remembered most of them. But the boy did. He pointed to one mark and said, "That's where the first betrayal happened." Then another. "That's where they met to plan the second." Then another. And that's where they decided I had to die. His father, terrified, asked, "Who are you talking about, son?" The boy didn't hesitate. "The ones who built the world you're living in. The ones who took control when the war ended. The ones who used my death to clean their hands." He spoke of men who funded railroads and banks. Men who profited from the chaos Jesse had exposed. Men who needed the outlaw dead not because he was a criminal, but because he knew things that would ruin them. The boy began assembling a list, names of men long dead, and men still alive connected to the same network Jesse had once tried to dismantle. He didn't write them alphabetically or chronologically. He wrote them in the order of guilt. And the deeper he went, the more his voice shifted into something older, calmer, sharper, like a blade remembering its owner. His followers no longer just drifters, but a growing circle of discontented men kept watch around the farm. Not for outlaws, not for rivals, but for agents, because by now everyone understood what the boy represented. A living archive of suppressed history, a direct threat to the sanitized narrative that powerful men had spent decades constructing. A voice from the past calling out names the present wanted forgotten. And he said something else, something that chilled even the men who believed in him. "They got me once because I trusted the wrong man. I won't make that mistake again." For the first time in a century, the past wasn't just bleeding into the present. It was preparing to fight it. Listen closely now, because this final part of the story is where the line between what can be proven and what must never be spoken begins to blur, and you'll feel it deep in the spine long before you understand it. For decades, historians tried to piece together the final days of the Ashford Parish Investigation. Not because they wanted answers, but because the questions were so much worse. After the collapse of the archive, the surviving officers were relocated quietly, secretly to different jurisdictions. Each signed identical non-disclosure agreements dated twice, once with the present year, and once with a year the parish insisted no longer existed. But paper trails don't bleed. People do. Detective Calder was the first to break. He told a journalist that he could hear the same four knocks every night, as if someone had memorized the sound of his heartbeat. His neighbors reported him sleepwalking toward the woods behind his house, always muttering the same fragmented phrase. "Don't answer the door. Don't answer. Don't." Weeks later, they found him in those same woods. Not dead, not alive, just sitting, eyes open, staring at a doorframe made of branches he had assembled himself, the hinges carved from his own fingernails. Calder never spoke again. Then there was Dr. Etta Rowan, the archivist who locked the basement door. She spent the rest of her life trying to map the pattern, filling entire rooms with sketches of footsteps, doorways, and spirals that all curved toward a single point she refused to explain. Shortly before she went missing, she told her assistant, "We didn't seal a chamber. We sealed a pathway." And then, just like the records, she vanished. The Ashford Parish building was eventually demolished, but construction workers reported hearing knocks from under the floor, even after the foundation was removed. One worker quit on the spot, claiming something knocked back when his boot struck the dirt. Years later, the site is still abandoned. The ground refuses new structures. Nothing grows there. Not even insects linger. And if you stand on the old foundation at midnight, locals say you might hear faint footsteps circling around you, slow, deliberate, stopping only when they reach your back. But whatever you do, whatever you think, whatever curiosity crawls up your throat as you listen to this, do not turn around. Before you leave this video, write, "I heard the knocks" in the comments. It helps more people find the story and marks you as someone who made it to the end. Subscribe for more forbidden history stories, but only if you're willing to open the next door.